Yeah, I'm Martin Mel Pall. I'm Professor Emeritus of Biochemistry and Basic Medical Sciences at Washington State University. I've been interested in electromagnetic fields and their health effects for several years now, and I'm very concerned about the Navy's plans for the Olympic Peninsula. And my talk basically is going to have three different parts to it. One is a historic part, looking back quite a number of years to what we knew 30, 40 years ago, and then more recently, how these electromagnetic fields work in the body. And this is something I stumbled into about 3 years ago, and what the health effects of that are, what the health consequences of that mechanism is. Finally, I will talk about what the Navy has to say and what the scientific merit may be of what the Navy has to say. So those are the three aspects. So let's start with the history, some of the history of this. Back in 1971, the Office of Naval Research came out with a report listing over 100 health effects of low-intensity field exposures, low-intensity microwave EMFs. And so they had this list basically of over 100 different things. And they also had in a separate document over 2,300 citations about the scientific literature that argues that these things occur in response to these low intensity fields. And so all of this then argues that most of these effects are non-thermal. That is, they're not being produced by heating, they're being produced by much, much lower intensity fields that have essentially no heating effect. So that was now 44 years ago. And about 10 years later, NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration in the US, came out with another report also showing that there were many non-thermal effects. This was focused in humans, and it was mainly based on occupational exposures. That is, people who were being exposed to these fields as a function of their occupation and what sort of health consequences occurred in those people as a consequence of that. So that was in 1981. And then in 1994, the US Air Force came out with another report. This came out of Rome, New York, where they have a laboratory. And they also acknowledged that there were non-thermal effects. So all three of these US government organizations acknowledged that there are non-thermal effects of these fields and that they have substantial health effects. Now, I have to say, for whatever reason, about 2 years later, all of this knowledge, and there's a huge amount of it, kind of disappeared. And at least in the US, although in other countries, people have widely acknowledged that these things are occurring still, and some people in the US do as well. And the fact is that the safety standards that have been developed by various organizations are entirely based on heating, okay? So they assume that there are only heating effects that can occur. And we know, as I've already said, that that's not true. And there's extensive evidence, thousands of studies that show that it's not true. Let me just say, the latest paper that I published, and this just came out a few weeks ago, looks at the 2014 Canadian report, which also argues for heating, and goes through all of their arguments. And you should look at that paper and you'll see, I think, that those arguments have no merit at all. I mean, they're basically very easy to rebut. Okay, so now the question is, how do these fields work, these low intensity microwave EMFs? How do they work in our body? And that's been a great puzzle up until recently. And I, basically stumbled on the answer to this about 3 years ago and published a paper on it a little less than 2 years ago. And what I found was that there were a whole series of studies where people could block or greatly lower the effects of these fields by using what are known as calcium channel blockers. Now, calcium channel blockers are drugs that are known to be highly specific for blocking what are called voltage-gated calcium channels, and I'll be talking a lot about those, and they're abbreviated VGCCs, voltage-gated calcium channels. And so what these studies show then is that the way the EMFs work is by activating these voltage-gated calcium channels, and when they become active, what happens is that these channels, which are in the plasma membrane of cells, these channels can open up and they can allow large amounts of calcium to flow into the cell. And it's the excess calcium in the cell that is responsible for most of the biological effects. The calcium channel blocker studies are the most important studies that clearly showed the VGCCs were the targets here of these fields. But there are a whole bunch of other studies that also support that view. There are close to 1,000 studies that have been published showing that these EMFs, have effect on calcium fluxes and calcium signaling in cells. And so that provides other kinds of evidence suggesting that the VGCCs are involved. And there was a very important study that was published in 2012 by Arthur Pilla, who showed that you could take cells in culture and expose them to a pulsed microwave field. And again, these are all at levels well within safety standards, okay? So these are not heating effects. And what you get is you get essentially instantaneous increase in calcium calmodulin-dependent nitric oxide. You get an almost instantaneous increase in intracellular calcium, which then produces an almost instantaneous increase in nitric oxide synthesis, okay? And we know the enzymes that make nitric oxide, two of them are calcium dependent, so they get activated when you get a lot of calcium coming into the cell. So that argues that this activation of the VGCCs is almost instantaneous. I mean, all of this occurs in less than 5 seconds. There's another kind of evidence which argues that these fields are acting directly on the VGCCs. And this is discussed in my paper, my recent paper, Reviews in Environmental Health paper. And what that says is that these VGCCs have a voltage sensor. This has been known for decades, something that detects electrical changes. And the physical properties of that voltage sensor predict that that voltage sensor is highly sensitive to these fields. So this is, you know, like 1,000,000 times probably more sensitive than almost anything else in the cell. So, so that argues that this is probably, you know, the direct target of the fields, and they then activate directly, and you get this big increase in calcium in the cell. Now, when you have this effect occurring, you can get a whole series of consequences that are health related. And so, for instance, so when you have microwave, and by the way, lower frequency EMFs can also do this, as well as microwave frequency EMFs. So they activate the VGCCs, they increase intracellular calcium, and now at that point several things can happen. One is that, as I mentioned before, you can get a big increase in nitric oxide, NO, and the nitric oxide can act in two ways. One is it can act to act along a nitric oxide signaling pathway to produce therapeutic effects. So there are real therapeutic effects of these fields when they are at appropriate levels and when they're focused on a particular tissue that needs therapeutic response in it. And they go through that, the cyclic GMP signaling pathway. And that's what I argued in my first paper on this. And Arthur Pilla, who's a real expert on this, argued a very similar mechanism at almost identical time, and as a general mechanism for therapeutic effects. So we're in good agreement on that, and so I think that's almost certainly true. But you can also get nitric oxide reacting with superoxide, and superoxide is something else that's raised by intracellular calcium, and to form peroxynitrite, which is a potent oxidant. And that in turn can break down to form free radicals and to produce oxidative stress and to produce lots of problems that can have pathophysiological, that is, damaging effects in the body. And in addition, there are other calcium signaling mechanisms that also go on. Calcium signaling is very, very important in the cells of our bodies, and in fact the cells of almost all eukaryotic organisms. And so when you have excessive calcium signaling, that can produce pathophysiological effects as well. So we think that that's what's going on here, and that you get pathophysiological effects through those different pathways, and then you can also get therapeutic effects through the nitric oxide signaling pathway. Now, what I've looked at then is how the various kinds of things that have been reported to occur in response to these low-intensity, non-thermal exposures. So these are things that have been reported over and over and over again to occur in us, to occur in experimental animals, to occur in cells derived from the cells of our bodies. All of these things can occur through those mechanisms that we just talked about. Okay, so those include, first of all, oxidative stress. And we know, in fact, that oxidative stress can be produced in the human body in response to low-level field exposures. And that comes from the peroxynitrite mechanism that we talked about briefly before. We know that you can get single-stranded breaks in cellular DNA and also double-stranded breaks in cellular DNA, and those can be produced through the free radicals that attack the DNA. Okay, and we know that. And in fact, there is evidence that that's the mechanism because you can use free radical scavengers to lower the effects on DNA of these fields. Okay, so there shouldn't be any question about that. And of course, whenever and there are other what are called genotoxic effects that occur as well. There are other ways in which the cells, the DNA of the cells of our bodies are attacked by these fields. Okay, so there are other kinds of changes that occur. And those, of course, are very problematic because they can be involved in causing cancer, and they can also be involved in causing mutations in the germline, so mutations that affect our progeny. And so one thing that's been found, again, repeatedly, is that certain kinds of cancer can occur in response to exposure to these fields. And let me just say, you will find that the industry will challenge that, and I'm sure they will keep challenging that. But the scientific evidence, I think, is very clear on that. You do get cancer of various sorts in response to these field exposures, and we now know how you can get it. And so there are, again, downstream effects that we talked about in that figure that are produced by excessive calcium in the cell. And these then can produce changes which we know can cause cancer in other situations. So it's not a surprise at all that they can produce cancer in response to these microwave EMF exposures. There's breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. That's been reported repeatedly in humans and in experimental animals. We know how that can occur. Male and female infertility are also involved, and in that, again, we know how those things can be produced. I suspect the infertility is actually more complicated than what I'm proposing here, but there are quite a number of mechanisms by which these microwave fields can produce infertility, and there may, as I said, there may be other mechanisms in addition to the ones that I've listed. Therapeutic effects we already talked about. One of the things that is not widely known but is extensively documented, there are diverse neuropsychiatric effects of these fields. And this is basically because the cells of the brain are highly sensitive to these EMFs. And I think the reason they're highly sensitive is there's very high densities of these VGCCs in all of the neurons in the brain, because the VGCCs are very important to brain function. So they have very high densities there, and you get effects on the cells of the brain that have been extensively documented in animal studies, and they in turn produce diverse neuropsychiatric effects. Depression is one of them, but there are many others. So, and let me just say, there's something like 27 different epidemiological studies that have shown that there are such effects in humans on low-level exposures to these fields. So this is of great concern, I think, because when you look at the combination of these effects, it means that we really can't predict what this is going to do to our functioning as individuals, to our whole social structure, based so much on our brain function, our social interactions, all those kinds of things. We are in a brave new world now, and it's really scary. There are also effects on melatonin depletion and sleep disruption. And I think some of the sleep disruption is caused by the melatonin depletion, some of it is caused by other mechanisms. Cataract formation has been argued repeatedly to be caused by heating. In fact, it's not caused by heating. There is increased intracellular calcium has an essential role in cataract formation. And the peroxynitrite we talked about earlier also has a role, and oxidants also have a role. So, so this is almost certainly produced by VGCC activation and not by heating. And in fact, there are studies that have been done to test the heating mechanism that have shown it's not due to heating. Okay, so that notion is false. And finally, there are cardiac effects, which I think are quite serious and life-threatening. They include tachycardia, rapid heartbeat. They include bradycardia, slow heartbeat. And they include arrhythmia. And arrhythmias, as you may know, often lead to sudden cardiac death. We've been looking at an unexplained epidemic of sudden cardiac death in young, apparently healthy people, including young athletes who die in the middle of athletic competition. And these are unexplained. Are they caused by the EMFs? I don't think we know for certain, but that seems to be the most likely explanation. And so, this is another serious thing. Let me just say that when you look at these effects, that just these that are listed here, and let me say there are quite a number of other effects that many of us think are also going on, but they're less well documented than these. Just simply based on these, you can argue that these microwave EMFs are attacking the four things that we most value as individuals and as a species. They're attacking, first of all, our health. Secondly, our brain function. Thirdly, the integrity of our genomes, so the DNA of the cells. And fourthly, our ability to produce healthy offspring. All of those are clearly attacked based on the information that's given in this table. And so I think that, that in and of itself is extremely worrisome. And let me just say, these are not the only things that are going on. These are simply the ones that are best documented. I put this figure back on and showing microwaves acting through the VGCCs and excessive intracellular calcium. And all of those effects that we just talked about can be explained through these various effects that are produced by excessive intracellular calcium. And so, so none of those should be surprising. And they all occur, as I've already mentioned, in response to low intensity fields through non-thermal effects. The safety standards that we have are all based entirely on heating. They're based on the assumption that the only effects we have to worry about are heating effects. And we know absolutely that that is false, that there are literally thousands of studies that have shown effects at levels of exposure that produce essentially no heating and are not working through heating. And as I've already said, many, perhaps even all those effects, go through VGCC activation. Okay, so before considering what the Navy wants to do in the Olympic Peninsula, it's important to consider why it is so difficult to estimate biological effects of these exposures when the biological effects have not been directly measured. Okay, and there are really three important reasons for that. One is that we know that pulse fields are usually much more biologically active than our non-pulse fields. But we don't know enough about this to be able to predict how a particular pattern of pulsation will behave, okay, in terms of our biology. So we know that the Navy's planning to use pulse fields for this. We know that essentially all the biological devices that we're exposed to use pulse fields because that's the way they communicate. But as I say, we don't know enough about this to really be able to predict how a particular field will behave in our bodies as a consequence. Okay, so that's one area that's important. Another area is there are what have been called window effects. And this is where a particular intensity window of an EMF has a maximum response, okay? Produces a maximum biological effect, okay? So if you're looking at a field and you're going along and you're increasing exposure, what you find is at some point you get a big increase in biological effect, and then you keep increasing it and it comes back down. Okay, so intensity levels that are both lower and higher produce less effect. Okay, now so this produces a very complex, what are called dose response curves. You can't predict how things are going to behave, and so at a different intensity. And so in one study that was done, there were actually 5 different windows, at different intensities. So one over here, one over there, and so forth. Different intensities, you got different windows, but in between there were much lower effects. And, in one study, they found a window and they went up to 150 times higher exposure, higher intensity, and had a lower effect, 150 times. So, these things are very unpredictable. And so assuming, which the Navy does, that higher levels always give you bigger effects is just simply wrong. We know it's wrong. And finally, we know that different frequencies differ from one another in terms of biological effects. So all these things are extremely complex. And the only way to really measure biological effects is to measure biological effects. You need to look at the biology. And yet nobody's doing that. And the Navy has no plans to do it, as best I can determine. So that's that's kind of the bottom line. There are things about this that we simply don't know enough about. They're not really the things that the Navy says we don't know enough about. Now the Navy has 2 documents that are on the internet. One of them is the final September 2014 document. And in that very long document, it goes on for many, many pages. There are only 2 sentences in this entire document, which as far as I can determine, have anything to do with human health. And so let me quote this statement. There are no conclusive direct hazards to human tissue as a result of electromagnetic radiation. Links to DNA fragmentation, leukemia, and cancer due to intermittent exposure to extremely high levels of electromagnetic radiation are speculative. Study data are inconsistent and insufficient at this time, and then they have one citation to a Fauci et al. Article published in Mutation Research. So there are several problems with this 2-sentence statement. One is that they imply that you only have to worry about extremely high levels of exposure. And that's simply wrong. We know that because there are thousands of studies that have shown it's wrong over and over and over again. So, this is an implication. It is not explicitly stated here, but it indicates basically that the Navy doesn't really know what they're talking about. Secondly, they say links to DNA fragmentation are speculative. That's just simply not true. I reviewed the literature on single-stranded breaks in DNA in the first paper that I published. I found 19 different studies that found breaks in DNA. There were also 8 that did not. But what you also find when you look at that literature is that when you look at different cell types, they respond differently. So you can have one cell type responding with a particular field exposure, another cell type not responding. So when you see that difference, you're just looking at differences in cells. And we all know that different cells are different. They're not all the same. So that's not an inconsistency at all. It's just simply biological heterogeneity. Similarly, you find differences in different fields. And we've already talked about how those can be generated. So, so this is it's just sheer nonsense, the claim that these things are inconsistent. They're not inconsistent. There are no inconsistencies in those data. Okay, so that's one problem with this statement, this two-sentence statement. Another one is they say that the effects on leukemia are speculative. And when you look at the Fauci et al. Paper, that's not what they say at all. They say that childhood leukemia is, in fact, well associated with these exposures. So it is caused by those exposures. And so the one citation they make here contradicts statements that they make. And okay, so there are several other things I can say about this, but the Fauci et al. Article, and let me read you the title of the article. It says, DNA fragmentation in human fibroblasts under extremely low frequency electromagnetic field exposure. So the first thing is they find that there is DNA fragmentation. There is single-stranded DNA breaks in these cells. So that, again, contradicts what the Navy says that they say. Secondly, they're looking at extremely low frequency electromagnetic field exposures. So what are those? Those are the kinds of exposures that we get from the wiring in our house or from high voltage power lines. And those are not the kind of exposures that the Navy is planning to use in the Olympic Peninsula. So why they picked this study to cite as the only citation in this whole thing that presumably says that we don't have to worry about human health effects. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, it's just so this is an incredibly sloppy, poorly thought out document. It really is amazing.
Professor, can you talk about animals then, exposure to animals? In this,
yeah, wildlife. Yeah, I haven't said anything about wildlife in the Olympic Peninsula, and that's a good point. I think obviously animals are a similar concern, and specific types of animals are a special concern. So we know that birds seem to be particularly sensitive to these, particularly migrating birds, and this is a major migration flyway, and they really don't tell us anything that gives us any assurances that birds are not going to be severely impacted. We have some evidence that amphibia are very sensitive to these fields, and we've had a decline in amphibian populations over much of the world, which may be due, in part at least, to EMF exposures. And so the notion that they can assure us that none of that's going to go on here is kind of ridiculous. And there is some evidence that some groups of insects are particularly sensitive as well, including bees. Let me say that what's interesting and more than a bit surprising is that plants actually respond to these microwave EMFs in much the same way that we do. That is, in plants, there are calcium channels that have a voltage sensor that's really quite similar to what the VGCCs have in us and in animals, and those channels that occur in the plasma membrane of plants are activated by these fields. So the plants may be quite severely impacted as well, and so they give us assurances, and none of these things are going to happen. They give us no data whatsoever to support this. It's just sheer supposition. The Navy also has a second document which they put on, which is a short document. It's only 7 pages, which is their finding of no significant impact. Okay, that's the title of the document. And in there they have actually a slightly longer statement that relates to human health. So what they say is the Navy's safety policies and procedures ensure that placement of and use of both the fixed and mobile emitters is conducted safely and monitored at all locations. These procedures minimize the potential for interaction between military and civilian activities by ensuring that emitter operators adhere to specific safety precautions designed to prevent electromagnetic hazards to people, schools, and child care centers. Therefore, no significant impact on public health and safety would occur as a result of implementation of the proposed action. All right, so that's the sum total of what they have to say. So the sum total is basically, oh, we know what we're doing, therefore you don't have to worry about it. The problem basically is that they give us no evidence that they know what they're doing. So what the Navy is doing here is telling us they know what they're doing, but some of the things they tell us are frankly unbelievable. So let me give you a specific example of that. They say that they're going to monitor these responses at all locations. They give us no information of how they're going to monitor them or what they mean by all locations. Let me just say, because of the problems that I discussed before, the only way you can monitor these things is to measure biological effects. And you need to measure biological effects then at all locations. Frankly, it's totally unbelievable that they're gonna measure biological effects at all locations in the Olympic Peninsula while they're doing these studies. So my question, for the Navy is, well, what do they mean by this? I mean, this is totally, it's totally, there's no substance to it that you can figure out. And then when they say that when the procedures minimize the potential for interaction, and specifically to prevent electromagnetic hazards to people, schools, and child care centers, on what basis is this made? I mean, what is, we know that the safety standards are based on heating, and we know that heating is not the mechanism. So on what basis can you possibly make this claim? And the conclusion that therefore no significant impact on public health and safety would occur is based on a false premise. It's based on the premise that the safety standards have some scientific merit, which they don't. So, I mean, I have to say, frankly, I've seen a lot of, there's so many different things that are occurring in our world that are bizarre and shocking. And I thought I probably wouldn't see anything shocking to me anymore because I've been shocked so much that none of the things seem to be shocking. But I am shocked by this. This is incredibly sloppy. It shows no concern whatsoever for the health and safety of the people of the Olympic Peninsula. And I really find it bizarre that the Navy, which is supposed to be involved in protecting us, would expose us to these kinds of things that are clearly going to have major biological effects.